Personal Journal Entry, September the 19th. It has been days since I have heard from Annabelle or anyone at home. The empty silence is compounded by the atrocities witnessed with the movies. Only 3 left to go now, but the brief glimmer I had seen so recently has once again been squashed. I fear my path will only go further into the darkness. I fear I will never return from where it will lead. Hello and welcome to RotD Review of the Day, and today I am reviewing Puppet Master Axis of Evil, which is canonically Puppet Master 9, made in 2010, and the start of the Axis trilogy. So my first thoughts on this one were aesthetically, the last one we just saw was very different, but it was also non-canonical. It was Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys, a sci-fi original with Corey Feldman, which was very bright and cheer. I mean, it was a Christmas horror movie that was tongue-in-cheek sci-fi kind of thing. And this one is a return to form in the dramatic, darker, character-driven aesthetic that the Puppet Master series is more known for. And it's not that I didn't care for that. I actually was pretty on board with that. It's that everything else they did felt like a misstep. The previous movie had a sense of fun that I thought was missing from the franchise, and it seems to be missing again. The tongue-in-cheekness of it is not necessarily something that I require. You definitely get some tongue-in-cheek with the sci-fi originals. But it's not tongue-in-cheek, it's just a sense of overall fun that feels like it's missing. If it doesn't have tongue-in-cheek, if it's not self-aware and making fun of itself, that's fine. It doesn't need to, but I think it does need to be fun. And ultimately, it just wasn't. All the other issues I have with it, I think, are best covered within the categories. So let's go ahead and get into them. 4 different categories, as always, 25 points each for a total possible score of 100 points. And the plot of this one, I gave an 8 out of 25. The story structure was fairly passable, but the character development and the dialogue was pretty darn weak. The nature of this is it goes back in time again. It actually takes us to the very start of things when Toulon took his life, and it doesn't at that point fast forward to any new plot line. It actually takes place right then and there with a young man witnessing the Nazis coming out of his room and apparently having been privy to the notion of the puppets and so forth, and he was a woodworker. So he knew where the puppets were hidden, and he took them and went back home to Los Angeles, and the movie kind of picks off from there. And it turns into kind of a Nazi versus Allies kind of, supposed to be a spy thriller, I suppose. Has to do with kind of foreign power espionage situations. And like I said, from a actual just plain Jane story kind of thing, it was okay. It was very passable. It worked okay. I could see where they were going with it, and it wasn't a bad idea. It just was executed pretty poorly. Which gets us into the intent. The intent, I gave a 5 out of 25. Ultimately, I think in movies past with Puppet Master, I think the thing I said that was the biggest sin you can do, and I believe this across any movie, and not just Puppet Master and not just horror, but any movie, the worst sin you can make is making a boring movie. You can make a bad movie, just don't make a boring movie. And in this case, it wasn't boring. It actually had beats in it that flowed pretty well. But the big word that I can really use for this one was uninteresting. The characters were uninteresting. What happened to them was uninteresting. The puppets themselves, unfortunately, for the first time that I think I can really recall within this entire series, were uninteresting. And that's a darn shame, because they are the bright spot about this entire franchise, no matter how dark it got. Yeah, it was actually just fairly disappointing in that regard. It was supposed to be a character-driven, darker, return to the roots Puppet Master movie, and it just wasn't interesting. The kills weren't interesting. There was one that was okay, and that was Leech Woman's, and other than that, I wasn't bored. I was just tuned out by the time it was done. The acting, the acting I gave a 6 out of 25. There was some really, really poor delivery within this movie, and the main characters did an okay-ish job. There was a whole lot of badly written dialogue, and so I don't put a whole lot of fault on them for it. But even so, it wasn't delivered in the best way. But the big bring down of this was one of the central antagonists of a Japanese woman who was working with the Nazis. I guess they call her Dragon Lady. And the acting of this performer was absolutely terrible. She spoke with the cadence of somebody that had forgotten their lines and continued to forget their lines and constantly had to be fed them or remember them midway through a sentence. It was almost like she didn't quite remember what next to say. It was very distracting. It was very disappointing, and it really brought the acting score down. So 6 out of 25 for that. The technical, the cinematography and the camera work, it was definitely more professional and film-like than we've gotten in some of the Puppet Master movies, and even certainly in the last one, Sci-Fi Original, What Are You Gonna Do? This definitely felt more like a return to a film feel to it. So the technical gets a few more points for that. However, what really brings it down, and the technical did get a 9 out of 25. It was the best of the categorical lot. But what did bring it down and prevent it from getting any higher whatsoever was, unfortunately, the puppets. Though I don't think there was any stop motion to be had. Most of it was simple physical manipulation of the puppets themselves, which I think was unfortunate and a misstep because they were very static. And in films past, when a character like the Puppet Master or a Toulon or whoever was kind of their caretaker in that particular movie, whenever they would interact with that person, it was always fairly animated, fairly expressive. I mean, for characters that don't talk, they were very expressive. And in this one, they simply weren't. He would have them all lined up on a shelf and talking to them, and they would be stone still. And that's just unfortunate because the worst thing that I can say is if this had been the first Puppet Master movie, if this had been my first foray into watching a Puppet Master movie, I would not have fallen in love with the puppets. And I can't think of a whole lot worse to say. That is pretty darn bad. I love these puppets based on their interaction with their human caretaker and their expressiveness and the joy that they brought to the screen, both in their moments of cheerfulness and in their moments of killiness. And it just wasn't present with this one. They just felt very static. Even when they were expressing themselves to the Puppet Master, it was just very toned down, a little nod of the head from one of the characters while the other four were standing still. It was very, very disappointing. And that, if you're going to have a Puppet Master movie, then you better have some freaking puppeteers in your budget. Either that or some stop motion creation. And it just felt like that is the portion where they got the laziest in this movie. So that brought it down a whole lot. This actually was a fairly technically adept movie, and it would have been getting a whole lot higher, except that was a very critical element. And that's why it only got 9 out of 25 points. So that gives us a total of 28 out of 100 points. There won't be a deep dive for this one because there really wasn't a whole lot to dive into, and it is the first of a trilogy. It did it did finish with a cliffhanger. So there's 2 more movies to really go through with the Axis trilogy, and I imagine this entire storyline. So perhaps I will have a deep dive at the end of the third movie of the Axis trilogy, which will be the last step before we get into the Puppet Master, The Littlest Reich remake, and finish things off. So until then, I will see you tomorrow for Axis of, Puppet Master 10, Axis Rising. I will see you then. Thank you very much for joining me, and next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.